Are you an independent musician feeling overwhelmed by the endless act of juggling creativity, business, and self-care? You're not alone. That's why I created the Artist Mind Map. The Artist Mind Map is a free blueprint designed to help you get clear on the route you need to take to attain your career goals in alignment to your artistic values. This is not just another random PDF page for the forgotten corners of your hard disk. It's a timeless roadmap you can use for decades to come. Think of it as a go-to overview to consult. When you grab your free mind map, you get exclusive access to a masterclass that will take your career to the next level. I use the same methodologies and systems for my high-end paying clients and students. So why am I giving it to you for free? Simple. I want to build a community of artists who can count on each other for safe spaces. Music saved my life. I believe that you have all that it takes to be the artist you were meant to be, if you're willing to put in the work. And more importantly, understanding what that work is. And the Artist Mind Map was designed to help you do exactly that. So if this resonates with you, go to artistmindmap.com and download this resource. artistmindmap.com. Imagine a world that represents and confirms everything you think. Comfortable, isn't it? The mind loves a story that fits so much more than the truth that could potentially challenge it. But there's more. Once a belief settles in completely in our minds, how adept do you think our perception could be at reorganizing itself around it? Welcome to the world of confirmation bias. Let's discuss. Welcome to another session solo cast. These solo casts were designed to help independent artists and musicians like you navigate the very complex labyrinth that is your artistic practice and career. They're based on empirical research and experiences of my own career as an independent musician and an educator and coach working with artists just like you. The primary aim behind these sessions is to offer accessibility to the kind of education many of us need to work with in order to forward ourselves in these very confusing times as empowered and independent artists in the truest sense of the word. What is confirmation bias? For those of you who've never heard the term, confirmation bias is one of the most well-documented concepts in modern psychology, shaping politics, relationships, financial decisions, careers. And yet, outside academic circles, the concept is quite unknown, often misunderstood, and simplified into something worthy of a lot more examination than it gets. And then, somewhere along the way, pop psychology and the self-help industry added to the murkiness. And what is, in reality, a very fascinating and complex neurological process, flattened into something far more seductive. Belief attracts external reality. An attractive proposition indeed, but to understand its deeper implications, it helps to take a good look at the underlying narratives. Confirmation bias refers to our inherent human tendency to notice, interpret, and remember information that confirms our existing beliefs, while discounting evidence that contradicts them. The concept gained prominence through the work of psychologist Peter Wason in the 60s, whose experiments demonstrated that people tend to search for confirming evidence rather than that which might disprove their assumptions. Later on, there was a lot more research. For those of you, as usual, who are into the nerdy stuff, have a look at the blog post for a list of references. But cognitive scientist Raymond Nickerson, for example, amongst many others, showed that this tendency is not just a minor flaw in reasoning, but a pervasive one. It appears in political reasoning, legal judgments, medical decisions, and everyday interpersonal conflicts. The brain, as it turns out, is not a neutral observer, but an interpreter with preferences. Preferences that shape our beliefs and vice versa. Our brains are basically a prediction machine that constantly generates personal predictions about our environment while comparing incoming information to these in real time. It's called predictive processing. Some researchers will describe the brain as a system that updates its internal models of reality based on these incoming signals. And that process takes a lot of energy. So, what the brain does to economize its energy is favor stability, preferring interpretations that maintain existing expectations rather than exploring those that might need some rewiring. What this means is that perception itself is partly shaped by prior belief. What we see is deeply influenced by what we expect to see. Inversely, that which we are unfamiliar with will burn more energy to take notice of, process, and absorb. At least at a non-subconscious level, and there's a very specific reason I use that hyphenated term, non-subconscious. The result, though, the latter, the one which requires more energy because of the unfamiliarity of the information, will usually be categorized as the second viable option by the brain. Usually, stress on that. At some point, psychology became pop philosophy. It's been around for a while, and versions of the ideas discussed here, the ones I just elaborated on, made their way into popular self-help industry rhetoric over the years in multiple forms. But its loudest avatar probably made its strongest presence felt with the popularity of the Law of Attraction movement, LOA. The message was simple. You attract the events in your life. So think positively, visualize success, and the universe will manifest those beliefs into reality for you. It's a beguilingly appealing narrative and not something to dismiss lightly. What's more, it might actually appear to work for some people to varying degrees. But actual research in neuroscience suggests something far more interesting. And before I proceed, I should probably offer a disclaimer of sorts at this point that I'm not a scientist. That's a whole different discussion altogether. I'm just a musician trying to get some points across through my own lived experience. But I do find myself doing a lot of research on this into neuroscience, believe it or not. That's how high my levels of nerdiness have gone to in recent years. Okay, research in neuroscience suggests something far more interesting than what a law of attraction, for example, suggests. Research says beliefs influence what we notice, how we interpret events, the choices we make. All of these are influenced deeply by beliefs. So shifts in perception and behavior really can change certain outcomes over time, depending, of course, on what the context is. But conflating it with blanket statements on how thoughts reorganize all external reality directly and absolutely is when things start getting a little troublesome. The problem with positive thinking, which is another pop psychology Frankenstein, a bit of an older cousin of LOA, Law of Attraction if you may, comes with its own specific set of problems, often ending up encouraging people to treat belief as a cosmetic adjustment of sorts rather than a deeper psychological process. My dear friend and coach, Peter Crone, has a blunt way of describing it. Whipped cream on shit. He says it in context to the practice of positive affirmations, one of positive thinking's favorite tools. It's a bit crude, but it captures something crucial. If unresolved beliefs, emotional wounds, and murky identity patterns remain untouched, layering positive affirmations on top of them changes very little. The deeper architecture of the psyche continues operating exactly as before, meanwhile leaving cleaning the actual inner architecture up, a process, by the way, which is far more complex than motivational slogans tend to suggest, unattended. In fact, there are entire spiritual traditions that dedicate themselves simply to that process alone, cleaning up the inner architecture. Non-duality schools of thought, for example, often refer to it as, quote-unquote, getting ourselves out of our own way, getting ourselves out of the way or out of our own way. Now, whether external circumstances literally rearrange themselves based on belief may remain a provocative question, sitting somewhere between psychology, philosophy, and spirituality. I'm not going to pretend to have an answer to that. But what is far less ambiguous is the role belief plays in how we interpret and respond to what happens to us. And that agency often gets drowned out by the noise of poorly researched advice telling us what we ought to be believing. One camp tends to insist on relentless positivity as the answer, and another that the world is fundamentally hostile and optimism is naive. Two different poles, both of which can mutate into powerful forms of confirmation bias. The thing about beliefs is it can become a burden, or they can become a burden, excuse my grammar. The real problem begins when a nuanced psychological or even neurological insight is collapsed with a totalizing philosophy. When belief on its own is framed as the primary driver of reality, all outcomes start carrying a very different weight. Success, quote-unquote, becomes proof of alignment, and failure, quote-unquote, becomes evidence of the lack thereof. And over time, this can slide insidiously from empowerment into despair. What was meant to offer agency distorts into self-blame instead. Verified research has long linked patterns of self-blame to increased anxiety, depression, and reduced resilience in the face of stress. And when applied through the law of attraction lens, the self-doubt becomes difficult to ignore because we keep thinking if something is not working, it's easy to oversimplify that into incorrect thinking. Taken then to its logical conclusion, this framing spirals downward into something far less supportive than it initially promises. Because if everything is attracted, then everything is deserved. And that is a cognitive dissonance the nervous system is not built to carry on a permanent basis. Real-world instances have displayed this train of thought beyond abstraction into very disturbing territory. One of the more visible examples of such is James Arthur Ray, a teacher associated with The Secret, an LOA Bible of sorts. It's when the whole law of attraction movement kind of blew up, whose teachings emphasized total personal responsibility for all outcomes. And during a retreat built around these ideas in 2009, participants were encouraged to push beyond physical limits in a sweat lodge ritual. 3 people died. The incident was later ruled as negligent homicide. Now, the point here is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to hold up a not-so-gentle reminder that no claim is foolproof beyond scrutiny and discretion. When belief systems remove inconvenient friction from reality, they can remove necessary boundaries with them too. So people dealing with health constraints begin to question whether they've somehow created their condition. Individuals navigating financial or relational difficulty internalize failure as a flaw in their mindset. Survivors of genuine intense trauma are left carrying an underlying layer of confusion and shame, wondering if they attracted what happened to them. So the general rhetoric is, if something works, it's taken as confirmation that the belief is law. And when it doesn't, the explanation often offered is that the same law has not been mastered adequately by the practitioner just yet. Meanwhile, the system remains intact either way. It's a loop where the law of attraction cannot fail. Only the individual can. Think about that one. This is a good time to assert that none of this negates the value of intention, perspective, a healthy growth mindset, or inner work. I'd be the first to be a proponent for those aspects. But it does reveal that the relationship between belief and reality is far more complex than oversimplified narratives by business entities that have built empires around a very questionable philosophy. The good news, though, that complexity involved in all of this is not a problem. In fact, it's actually a starting point for where the actual agency begins. Also, a spiritual life does not require blind faith. That's a myth I'm more than happy to bust. I'd like to state clearly that I feel questioning simplified interpretations of something like the law of attraction doesn't equate to adopting a strictly materialistic reductionist worldview. Many philosophical traditions and even neuroscientists have long suggested that the internal state of the mind does indeed influence how external reality is experienced. In Buddhist philosophy, the opening verses of the Dhammapada emphasize that the mind precedes experience. In Stoic philosophy, thinkers argued that suffering arises less from the events themselves than from the judgments we attach to them. The concept of karma, better known as karma in the West, when studied, even hints at many points that could be considered a far deeper take than what the law of attraction has essentially appropriated, in my humble opinion. Some folks like Joe Dispenza and Emily MacDonald, while probably not the most popular figures in mainstream scientific circles, actually do have a background in science and have been doing some serious and thorough research on these correlations as well. Now, these ancient traditions and more recent thought leaders don't directly propose that thoughts magically manufacture external events, but they point towards something subtler, the mind's interpretive power, and the influence that has on our behavior, emotions, and eventually on the circumstances that come into our lives. Tat tvam asi. I probably butchered that sentence. It's an ancient Sanskrit line. It's been a while since I studied Sanskrit. I did only 1 year of it during my 13 years in India. So you'll excuse me for my pronunciation, please, for those of you who are Sanskrit experts. The literal translation of that is, thou art that, or more plainly, you are the reality. Something on those lines. It's from the Chanda Yoga Upanishad. This ancient Sanskrit metaphor was never meant to be a mechanical law in the literal sense. It was actually an invitation to deeper awareness. And modern neuroscience seems to increasingly echo this insight from one of the world's oldest philosophical texts. Emotional states influence attention, perception, memory, and decision-making. So the inner landscape of the mind does shape the external world we inhabit psychologically. A few months back, I wrote an article on negativity bias. Now, there's another cognitive tendency that complicates this entire conversation a bit more. Researchers and colleagues have had a lot to say about this, but one particular line that stands out to me is by a gentleman called Roy Baumeister. And he summarized this entire phenomenon, negative bias, with a very succinct phrase: bad is stronger than good. Now, that might sound a little dire, but hear me out. The explanation behind this is that negative events leave stronger psychological impressions on the brain than positive ones. And from an evolutionary perspective, this makes total sense. I mean, missing a potential threat could be fatal, while missing a pleasant opportunity, a lot less risk for our ancestors back in the day when they were hunter-gatherers living in caves. The result? A human brain that has been wired down the generations to pay disproportionate attention to danger, criticism, and loss. The effect this bias has on our everyday life does not get talked about enough. From news cycles to social media, relationships to other personal narratives about our own lives. Meanwhile, despite the real challenges we face in the world, the number of systems that actually keep functioning as they should, around us is enormous. Communities cooperate, infrastructures function, people build relationships, fall in love, raise families, create art. Humans are solving problems every day. And I'll give you this, none of these are done perfectly, but they still outnumber the dangers being sensationalized astronomically. But the brain doesn't naturally track equilibrium with the same alertness as it does potential threats. So when negativity bias combines with confirmation bias, it is a potent combination. A person who believes the world is collapsing will effortlessly collect evidence that supports the belief. A person who believes relentless positivity is the only acceptable mindset will filter out signals that suggest otherwise. Both narratives can't help but affect neutrality. Confirmation bias in the life of creatives, artists, musicians, founders, entrepreneurs. For us, it can become especially intense because creative work sits close to our identity. Feedback rarely feels objective. Every response is potential evidence about who we are, and the mind soon begins assembling a story. We interpret rejection as proof that our career is hopeless on some days. Others will interpret the same as confirmation that they're misunderstood visionaries. And while both interpretations may feel convincing in the moment, neither is necessarily accurate. Because creativity, especially in a professional context, often oscillates between two poles. One extreme lies in self-sabotage, and the other in self-mythology, or even narcissism in some extreme cases. Though I try and avoid that word. Overused, rather underqualified, myself included. Either way, the pendulum can swing between these states with surprising speed. Speed is a big one. It happens so fast that in most cases we're not even processing what's actually happening. And that's when confirmation bias fuels both of these narratives. To add to it all, spiritual language, when abused, is an open door to amplify this pattern. A stalled project becomes a sign that the universe is testing you. A random coincidence becomes confirmation that success is guaranteed. The mind always finds the evidence it needs, while the deeper work actually lies somewhere else entirely. So, what gives in this entire situation we're dealing with here? Yeah? I think there's actually a real invitation in all of this. Before I go ahead, let's get something straight. Confirmation bias is not a flaw. You don't want to remove it from human cognition completely. It's an inherent part of the architecture of the mind. In fact, as counterintuitive as it sounds, it might even be a sign of brain health. So the real question is not whether we have biases, because we all do, but how aware we are of them. And more importantly, how we proceed from there. Creativity requires a belief system and self-worth strong enough to survive uncertainty, rejection, and criticism. But it also requires incredible quantities of intellectual honesty to examine assumptions when circumstances provide new information that doesn't line up with them, the assumptions. I have a bit of a confession here at this point. The irony in all of this is that I would probably qualify as someone you'd catch using a lot of the spiritual language that I invite critical thinking towards in this episode. Hey, I'm even open to the theory that our mindset is actually playing a far deeper role in our trajectory than most of us have been trained to identify. I'm probably even a little more than just open to that. Truth is, I even practice the philosophy, for lack of a better term, that our external world is a reflection of our inner state, albeit at my own risk, and with what I hope is a healthy dose of skepticism and discernment. So, why am I bothering with this topic, this whole law of attraction shabam? The answer might disappoint you. See, I am a dude who spent 13 years in India as an adolescent. India, the former spiritual capital of the world, watching relentless eat, pray, love tourists building empires out of their half-baked extractions. It was a different world, one where tourists could extract what they wanted, leaving the people they were extracting from with very little tools to check in on what was actually being extracted from them and being done with the same. Only one of these two parties had the degree of mobility that enabled them to carry out this entire extraction. And being witness to this at the time was not a lot of fun. I'll be honest about that. I personally haven't had the easiest path to get to where I did in my life. It wasn't the hardest, but it wasn't the easiest either. And while I'm not a fan of wearing scars as a badge of honor per se, let alone trauma as an identity, not my thing, I struggle more often than I'm probably comfortable admitting to forgive certain demographics, blissfully oblivious to the head start life gave them, patronizing me after watching the newest self-help bestseller. I've lost friends to these struggles, people I loved. So I'd feel like a hypocrite saying that all of this is in the name of research and just that. It is a little personal for me. But there's also the semantic part to the story. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a law as I'm going to read this out. A law is a statement of a fact deduced from observation to the effect that a particular natural or scientific phenomena always occurs if certain conditions are present. Now that's the standard the so-called law of attraction simply does not meet, despite its claim. Also, fun fact, it took me years of pretty intensive multidisciplinary study to find evidence of sorts, both theoretical and practical, for me to start actually noticing patterns that might point towards what the law of attraction magnified and kind of blew out of proportion. And I concluded for myself that the physics of it all, if that's a thing, I'm using physics as a metaphor here just to clarify, is not black and white, and far removed from a banal if this equals then that equation. Practical ways to tackle confirmation bias, if this is something that might be affecting you more than you'd like it to. Some practices that might help you loosen up a bit or loosen the grip of this whole confirmation bias thing in everyday life are: look for disconfirming evidence just as a practice. When forming a belief about your work or career or life, deliberately ask or seek for evidence that might contradict it. You don't have to believe it, but check out if there are other opinions or other forms of information out there which contradicts it directly. Number 2, separate identity from feedback. I did this post once on signal versus noise ratio. Separate your identity from that feedback loop. Number 3, diversify mirrors. Seek feedback from people outside your immediate circle. Number 5, track narratives. That's a fancy way of saying do stuff like journaling or some reflective practice, mindfulness exercises, meditation if you have a proper teacher who's showed you how to go about it. These can reveal repeating patterns in how the mind interprets events and help you clarify a lot of exactly what's going on. Last but not the least, work with peers, mentors, coaches who can challenge you authentically. The right coach or a mentor doesn't reinforce your beliefs or impose theirs. They help you examine them. And if coaching or mentorship is something you don't have a budget for, consider seeking out a peer you trust, whose objectivity and fairness you trust, to get the ball rolling. Conclusion to today's somewhat passionate recording session, podcast session. I'm reminded of this sentence I read in one of my favorite books ever by Mark Levine, who's like this jazz theory guru. I think it was in his the jazz piano book or jazz theory book. So I'm paraphrasing. He said something about music is 99% about things you don't understand and 1% of what you can. And that 1% is music theory and technique and something on those lines. I'm paraphrasing. So, folks, I'm a musician. I do not believe in magic. I think magic is legit. There's magic all around us. But it's just not what it's being sold at in so many circles. In my humble opinion, the most useful stance is neither blind optimism or faith, nor rigid skepticism. I think the path forward is a completely different thing altogether. Curiosity. A willingness to notice when the mind is assembling evidence to support an emotionally convenient story, dig deeper to inquire about the accuracy of the same, and the courage from time to time to ask what else might also be true. What else might also be true? During my coaching with Peter Crone, who, as you might have noticed by now, plays a significant role in my current trajectory, I remember him describing one of the biggest pitfalls of intelligence. He called me smart, flexing here, but there's a deeper aspect to this. He described one of the biggest pitfalls of intelligence, my intelligence specifically, as the ability to gather sufficient evidence to prove what it believes, including the dystopian type. So in my case, I have always tended to err on the side of slight skepticism, over-skepticism, or even cynicism, mild cynicism. I've had to work really hard to get over it. But part of the reason I had to work as hard as I did, because I was intelligent enough to always find evidence to support my cynicism as some kind of absolute truth. It's not. So I'll own it. Being smart can actually make us act dumb. Give us ample reason to believe things that feel familiar and shun those that don't. Now, whether or not that's a strength or a weakness is anyone's guess, and probably its own bias as well. But generally speaking, I don't think the world as we know it is just concrete matter and a simplistic life sucks and then we die story. Our emotions, our beliefs, perspectives are not completely disconnected from the events that occur in our life. So, does that mean I think the law of attraction works after all? I'm just being a stubborn mule and not admitting it? I don't know. That's for you to decide. Or maybe not, I don't know. But here's my official response to the elephant in the room, which is the law of attraction real or not? What do you think, TL? Okay, here's my official answer. Okay, you ready? My honest answer is this. It doesn't matter. I don't care. Because the way I see it, working on our well-being, digging deeper into our belief systems, believing in the goodness of our world, doing the best we can, believing that the future is bright and positive, these don't need any law to exist. Forget be true or false. It doesn't need a law to exist. Who we choose to be, the thoughts we choose to think, how we navigate the emotions we do, is an identity we either consciously embrace or don't. It's as simple and complex as that. So, I hope this episode helped you in some way. I've been meaning to address this for a while now. There have been two topics I've had so many people ask me to officially express my opinions on. Law of attraction was the first. The second one is AI in the recent past, which I'll probably unpack at some point, but I'm still in the thick of it, drawing some major conclusions. But the law of attraction has been around for a while now because this thing's so tricky and everybody's buying into it, which is not my place to judge. But, if we are buying into something, the least we can do is have a long, hard look at the product we've decided to consume. I hope that helps. Hey folks, I hope you found that episode helpful. Here's a little request. If you did, consider sharing this episode with your folks. Think about the ways in which they might benefit the way you did. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out if you have queries. My name's TL. I'm an independent musician and educator and the founder of the Holistic Musician Academy.